that I'm supported by Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister. I'm supported by John Major, the former Prime Minister. And I'm supported by William Hague, the next Prime Minister.
How did they get it so wrong for so long? Good evening. Jeffery Archer was jailed for 4 years today after a jury decided he told lies under oath in his 1987 libel trial. Lord Archer won't have his title removed, but his reputation is shot, and the evidence of his wife Mary now looks to have been rather misleading too. We'll ask the former Tory cabinet minister and prison inmate Jonathan Aitken what tempts powerful men to lie. World leaders meet in Genoa and cut themselves off from the world. How the so-called forces of globalisation are confined, yet again, behind tall fences and barbed wire. And President Bush saw a streaker in London. Did he expose his own missile policy? Lord Archer is in Belmarsh prison tonight, his whole life exposed as a farrago of lies. Among those he deceived were a judge, 2 prime ministers, an entire political party, the Oxford University admissions department, his own wife, and for that matter, just about everyone else. Newsnight's very own Michael Crick, Archer's biographer, has followed every twist in the Archer tale over a decade, often prompting the former Conservative deputy chairman into moments of fury. Michael also followed the court case day by day. Here's his report.
The money will be in the package. It will be delivered to you at 11 o'clock. At platform number 3, and you will be in a green leather suit.
Tomorrow morning?
Tomorrow morning, and you'll go abroad as quickly as you can.
Okay.
And you'll phone me from abroad.
That tape of Jeffery Archer offering money to a prostitute was the start of a story that led from platform 3 at Victoria to, 15 years later, court 8 at the Old Bailey. It was here in Mayfair late one night in 1986 that Monica Coughlin, the prostitute on the tape, always said Jeffery Archer agreed to pay her £50 for sex. He denied it, sued 2 newspapers and won a staggering £550,000 in damages. 13 years later, in the midst of the London Mayor campaign, Ted Francis, an old friend, revealed that he'd been asked by Archer to provide him with a false alibi during his libel case against the Star newspaper in 1987. Astonishingly, the novelist was again entrapped on tape.
Yes, what you said to me, what were you doing on September the 9th last year? So, I could find that. And you said, well, we had dinner here, didn't we? And I said, well, if you say so. Do you remember?
Yeah, but we've got to be careful, Ted.
Yeah.
We don't want to go to court of law with this.
When it came to that court of law, in fact, the most damning evidence came from his former secretary, Angie Pepiad. She told how Archer had asked her to forge a diary for the libel trial. And amazingly, the fake diary was accepted as genuine by everyone involved in the 1987 case, even though most of it was blank. But for her own safety, Pepiat kept a copy of the original diary, which wasn't produced in court, and which strongly suggested that Archer's key alibi witness had lied. If shown then, that diary would have destroyed his libel case. The judge, Mr. Justice Potts, said the jury had made the right decision and was unequivocal in what was his last trial. The jury, he said, have convicted you on clear evidence. I take the view that these charges represent as serious an offence of perjury as I have had experience of, and as I have been able to find in the books. It seems hard to believe. He went on to say, sentencing you, Lord Archer, gives me no pleasure at all, I assure you. It has been an extremely distasteful case. Ted Francis, meanwhile, was acquitted on his charge of attempting to pervert the course of justice.
As you can imagine, that I am enormously relieved that the whole business is over and done. I'd also like to say a great deal of thanks to my wife and my family, my friends, for all the support and help they've given me, and for never doubting that it will all turn out all right.
Lord Archer's QC, Nicholas Purnell, argued for clemency on the rather odd grounds that since Lord Archer hadn't given evidence in court and hadn't agreed to do an interview with the police, he therefore couldn't have compounded his original offences. Whereupon the judge said, but what about Lady Archer? For clearly Mr Justice Potts was very sceptical about what Lady Archer had to say, and in particular the fact that she'd come forward only on the 18th day of the trial with her statement that she remembered the A4 diary which had been produced in court in 1987 and which Angie Pepiat alleged was a forgery. Given the judge's comments, Lady Archer may now face questioning from the police on her part in the case. Whereas during the 1987 trial, her evidence had clearly been vital to her husband, this time it badly backfired. In the previous hearing, the judge was so taken with the fragrant Mary Archer that he found it inconceivable her husband would want to have sex with a prostitute. Mary came to court both times to insist they still had a full and happy marriage. But the facts suggest otherwise. One former mistress, Andrina Cahoon, was forced into court this time to admit to their 8-year affair. Another mistress has been less shy.
Hello, I'm Sally Farmerlow. I had an affair with Jeffery Archer for 3.5 years.
She was paid £100,000 for her story, and we may soon hear more. And this February, Archer was seen hand in hand with another blonde, Nikki Kingdon, on a South African beach. The novelist's troubles don't end there. The Inland Revenue are investigating hundreds of thousands of pounds of cash that Archer brought back from a Jersey bank account in the 1980s. And the loser in the libel trial, the Star newspaper, is suing Archer for £2.2 million for fraud.
He lied and lied in the 1987 trial. Quite a lot of other people lied as well, as we now know. There was no way at that time that we could have won the case because of the lies that were told.
Archer was taken from the Old Bailey to Belmarsh prison, though he'll probably spend most of his sentence in an open jail. And the judge said he can't even apply for parole for 2 years. Not even his most skillful literary editors can do much about this sentence.
Michael Crick reporting. Now, we asked the last three leaders of the Conservative Party, Lady Thatcher, John Major and William Hague, all of whom offered Jeffery Archer their patronage, to talk to us tonight. They did all decline, but Mr Major said he was saddened and he hoped that people would remember the many kind and generous things that Jeffery has done. Well, we're here with Peter Hill, the editor of The Star, who you saw just there in the film. Jonathan Aitken joins us from Washington. Matthew Parris, Times columnist, is here, sympathetic to Lord Archer. And Emil Nicholson is here, who was vice chair of the Conservative Party at the same time as Lord Archer was deputy chair. Mr Aitken, first of all, he's in Belmarsh. That's where you went after you were convicted. Will he be in bed by now?
Well, I think he will. I understand he's in a suicide watch cell, and I suspect he's finding it very difficult to get to sleep, not only because it must have been one of the longest and most painful days of his life, but also because I remember myself that the suicide watch cell is a very noisy place with the light on, people coming in to unlock the door, see if you're still there every few minutes. And also, if I know Belmarsh, which of course I do, I will bet that the prisoners are doing what's called a quizzy, which means those on heroin and so on are all yelling their heads off with obscenities all round him. So it's a pretty uncomfortable and rather frightening place, I suspect, and whatever he's done, I have some compassion for him this evening.
And what sort of contact will he be having in the first few days with those other inmates?
Well, he'll be having plenty of contact. He'll be doing what's called induction, which is a prison word for really orientating you, what has been a very disorientating experience so far. And he'll have the prison rules explained to him. He'll have to do, would you believe it, a literacy test to check his, what standard of literacy he has. He'll have psychiatric assessments made, make sure he's not a high suicide risk. He'll have to get used to all the routines, and quite soon he'll have to go to work at a prison workbench. I vividly remember spending a lot of time putting washers on screws, and that kind of work of a not very edifying or rehabilitating kind will be his diet for some time.
And how do you think that he will get on with the people he meets in that prison?
Well, I think Jeffery, for all his faults, is a man of some courage and resilience, and he's a good communicator. And I think he'll have a difficult time as a high-profile prisoner. Some people will go out of their way to be nice to him, and that's a reality of prison life. There's a lot of warm-hearted kindness among prisoners, but some will try and score points off him, will kind of not exactly bully him, or they may have that, but put him under pressure, give him a bit of needle. And but I think he'll be strong enough to come through it, distressing though the experience is for any prisoner, perhaps particularly for a high-profile prisoner.
So, Peter Hill from the Star, you want your £500,000 back?
With interest. It's really about 2.2 million by now, because it's 14 years ago.
How will the legal argument work there? Because the false alibi that was at the centre of this case wasn't actually used, was it, in your libel trial?
No, it wasn't, but all of Archer's other alibis were also false, as I think has now been proved, and the judge did refer to that. He said that there was no way that Archer would have won that case.
So what do you do now? You take a civil case out for the money?
We've already started proceedings to do that, and I'd rather hope that Archer would pay up before then, to avoid yet another court case which would humiliate him again.
Matthew Paris, did you feel less sympathetic to Jeffery Archer today, at the beginning of today, than you did at the end, or?
Very few of us in the media in London can honestly pretend to be very surprised by this verdict, or to have learnt anything we haven't known for quite some time already. I hope the Star get their money back. Jeffery robbed them of that money, and they deserve their money back. He deserves what he's got. Sympathy for Jeffery Archer is always out of place. He makes his own bed and he lies in it. Well, what I can't stand is all the dancing around and crowing and moralising. He's entertained us royally over the last few years. He's had his roller coaster ride. Many of the things he's done cannot be defended, and I wouldn't try to defend them. But he's been a colourful character. In the end, these guys go into one of two galleries. They either go into the gallery of seriously evil people, or they go into the gallery of rascals, rogues and scallywags, and I'm afraid I put him in the gallery of rascals, rogues and scallywags. He's not someone I feel like hurting.
Emma Nicholson, is that where you put it?
No, I'm afraid not, but then I have greater knowledge than Matthew Paris does of the funding that didn't seem to get to the northern Kurdish people after it had been raised. Many millions of pounds was claimed to have been raised by Jeffery Archer at the time of the Kurdish miseries in the Turkish mountains after the ending of the Gulf War, and for many years afterwards the Kurdish people came to me and claimed that the funding hadn't reached them. I felt that probably what they said was true, so not a rogue, no, a guy who hurts other people.
Where do you think the money went?
Well, that's a different story. I have my feelings, but it wouldn't be right for me to put them out here. But I did go and give evidence to the police last year on this particular case, because when the story was rerun again by the Star, the second time round, some years later, I suddenly realised the discrepancies. I was Conservative Party Vice Chair at the time. One of Jeffrey's staff had come to me, now someone in the House of Commons, and had commented on something he'd been asked to give the money, and I'd urged him not to.
So, Matthew Paris, hearing that, you want to adjust your description?
If Emma thinks that he stole the money, which seems to be the implication, that's a very serious allegation, and if it's true, he should be pursued for every penny of it, and he should be prosecuted for it. But I don't know if that is what you think. Is that what you're suggesting?
I used to be the fundraiser for the Save the Children Fund. I know full well the difference between claims of raising money and actually what reaches people on the ground, and there's a big gulf there.
Now, what about Mary Archer, Matthew Paris, and the position she finds herself in at the end of this trial? Because it's absolutely clear that the judge was very worried by some of the evidence she gave about that fake diary.
Yeah, sympathy for Mary Archer is also out of place and always has been. These people are much more grown up than we think. I have no doubt that Mary Archer found out a very long time ago the kind of man he'd married. Each of them understand each other very well. I have a pretty good idea that she'll have known quite a lot of what was going on, though perhaps not all. And she's come to terms with that marriage to that man and with that partnership. That's her problem. I have a feeling she's a pretty grown-up person who has not been taken in.
What about sympathy for the victims? Because this was not a victimless crime by Jeffery Archer. The editor of the Daily Star at the time, Lloyd Turner, was sacked. He suffered humiliating stress. He definitely died prematurely as a result of that stress. What about the humiliation of Monica Coughlin? She was a victim. These people are both dead now.
Newspapers...
they can never those people can never get justice. And what about that?
Newspapers like yours have had their part to play in the humiliation of Monica Coghlan, tabloid newspapers make their money from smut and from sex and from sleaze. I make no complaint about that. I'm glad we have
the
papers
Daily
like
Star
that.
Actually, the Daily Star suffered appallingly as a result of that trial.
The paper I write for is subsidised partly from newspapers who make their money in that way. But
Well, this is
I
up to
don't
you
mind
two.
being told by the Archbishop of Canterbury about the moral implications of this case, but from the editor of the Daily Star, too much moralising is out of place.
OK, let's just pause there. Let's just pause there. There was something about Jeffery Archer that the Conservative Party couldn't let go of. Let's go back to Michael Crick to find out how the man cast a spell that kept so many people enraptured.
He inherited the genes of a fraudster father who was jailed for embezzling charity funds. And though, ironically, he himself spent a few months as a London bobby, Jeffery Archer has been conning people all his life. He got into Oxford by lying he'd got 3 A-levels and an American degree, but went on to become one of Britain's top sprinters, aided by the occasional blind eye. For he had an unfortunate habit of jumping the gun.
Yes, Archer caused the break. Hang on. And again, it is Archer, I think, who caused it. Now, is he going to be warned again or even pulled out? It looked as he's out.
But he survived.
Metcalf this time there. Oh, another false one, and who's caused it? Now, this is very interesting. It looks like Archer.
3 false starts, but typical Archer, the powers that were gave him the benefit of the doubt.
This is Jeffery Archer speaking, your Conservative candidate for the by-election.
He got the benefit of the doubt too in 1969, when he rebuffed serious charges of fiddling his expenses for a charity to become Tory MP for Louth. But 5 years later, a bad investment forced his resignation from Parliament. To pay off his debts, he famously turned to writing, exploiting that Archer talent for make-believe.
I think the truth is, Ian, that I'm a storyteller, not a writer. I think I'm tell a yarn, my dear, as we used to say in Somerset. I'm a yarn spinner. I just sit down and tell a story.
And a money spinner too, as the fame and wealth rekindled his lifelong ambition to be Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher loved this living example of how to bounce back from ruin and made him Deputy Tory Chairman under Norman Tebbit. Until resignation number 2, barely a year later, over the Coghlan scandal. He wasn't in the political wilderness for long. He'd spotted and cultivated the next Tory leader long before John Major ever became PM. His reward was a seat in the Lords, and if Archer was to be believed, he became one of the Prime Minister's closest advisers.
But one thing that used to sort of drive me actually mad occasionally is journalists would sort of come up to me and say, oh, we understand John Major feels this or thinks that. And I'd say, you know, where on earth do you get this stuff from? And occasionally they'd say, oh, well, Jeffrey's obviously in the know and he's told us. And of course he wasn't in the know. And it was sort of very irritating. Jeffrey always had to give the impression he was absolutely at the centre of power and knew what was happening. I think it's what drove Jeffrey more than anything else.
Wily birds within the Conservative Party, people like, I don't know, Michael Heseltine, Ken Clarke, were wary of Jeffrey and steered clear of him. I don't know, gentler souls like John Major enjoyed his company, but weren't naive. Remember that Margaret Thatcher and John Major, who both valued him as a friend and took advantage of his great skills as a tub thumper, as a fundraiser, as a rallier of the troops, never gave him senior office.
1994 saw yet more scandal.
The Department of Trade and Industry has said that the senior Conservative Lord Archer is being investigated for alleged insider trading.
He'd made almost £80,000 on Anglia TV shares for a friend at a time his wife Mary, an Anglia director, was agreeing a takeover. DTI inspectors didn't find enough evidence to prosecute, but Archer never publicly explained himself. Anglia was the moment when Archer's career could and should have been stopped. And the remarkable thing is how the world allowed him to return to public life, even though he admitted it had been a grave error, and it raised severe questions about both his judgment and his integrity. But Archer simply lay low for a few months, refused all interviews, and then quietly returned to politics, almost as if nothing had happened. that was the time he should have been held to account, with tough questions not just by the media, but more particularly by his political colleagues. Astonishingly, within 5 years, the Tories had happily chosen Archer as their nominee for London Mayor, a job he saw as the next best thing to being Prime Minister. And they gave him all-star backing.
That I'm supported by Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister. I'm supported by John Major, the former Prime Minister. And I'm supported by William Hague, the next Prime Minister.
I say I've got a democratic party and the members choose. I have complete faith in his probity and integrity.
It wasn't just William Hague who stuck his neck out, despite many private warnings that it would end in tears. 8 heavyweight names wrote to the Daily Telegraph to lend their backing. We believe Jeffery Archer has the vision, the energy and the commitment to be an outstanding Mayor of London, said Parkinson, Rifkin, Fowler, King, Lilly, Howard, Lamont and Morwinny.
How nice to see you. Who's Jeffery Archer? Good to see you.
And Michael Portillo won't want reminding that he accepted the novelist's help on the streets of Kensington and Chelsea, just 7 days before the final resignation, which led Archer to the Old Bailey. Why did so many colleagues fail to see the danger signs?
Politicians admire rich people. They admire famous people. And they don't look into their backgrounds because they don't have time. Anyway, they're kind of allergic to looking into people's backgrounds because they don't want people looking into their own backgrounds. They have a sort of denial about it. And so they take them at face value, take advantage of them, move on.
A good luck banana.
Others treated Archer as merely a figure of fun, an amiable rogue, not to be judged by the standards of normal politicians. A more serious reason for his survival was his bullying of any journalist who dared broach awkward questions.
You think you run the world, Newsnight. That's why we hate you.
Watch out, Newsnight, he threatened in an unguarded moment.
You wait till we get Newsnight. It'll be £100,000 mark. We're going for the big one. What? No, we're not doing anybody till May the 6th. All the writs will go out on May the 6th.
The fascinating thing is how he charmed so many prominent people, and few saw through him. Large chunks of the British establishment would flock to his parties. But ultimately, it's Conservative leaders who take the greatest responsibility.
It seems extraordinary to me that 3 successive leaders should have had this lapse of judgment about Archer.
Yeah, well, you see, he's a very good con man. I mean, they would be the least of the people he's conned. I mean, as you know better than anybody, his entire life was a confidence trick. It was now you see it, now you don't. It just the man was very, very good at it.
The Tories did expel him for 5 years and may never let him back. But even after serving his sentence, Archer could still return to politics. For the seat that John Major gave him in the Lords is for life.
Jonathan Aiken, Margaret Thatcher famously didn't give you a ministerial job because she thought you were trouble with a capital T. Why didn't she make the same judgment with Jeffery Archer?
Well, I can't speak for Margaret Thatcher. She obviously made her own judgment on what was the best information available to her at the time. And it just should be remembered that Jeffery Archer, for all his faults, did a lot of good things too, both in terms of charitable fundraising. I'm sorry to hear what Emma Nicholson appears to be alleging, but in general terms he was a great fundraiser for charity and of course a great fundraiser for the Conservative Party, and that no doubt played a part in his rise.
Doesn't it shock you, just retelling that story there, that after the Anglia shares scandal he then becomes the Conservative candidate for Mayor of London?
Well, I think with the wisdom of hindsight, a lot of things perhaps should have been done differently. But I don't think it's profitable, except perhaps for journalists, to go raking over these old coals tonight. This is a personal tragedy. It's all ended in tears, and he's now got to pay the price for it. And I'm not sure it is a great interest to the world to go back into this or that mistake. He made a great many along the way.
it's quite a lot of interest to go back into quite a lot of the mistakes at this point, probably. And Matthew Parris, we heard him described there as a very good con man. Do you think that's an adequate description?
No, he wasn't a very good con man. I think one could understand Margaret Thatcher's, John Major's, William Hague's misjudgments if he were a very good con man, but the truth is he didn't fool us. He hasn't fooled anybody for quite a long time. I'm afraid that people were just prepared to look the other way. Margaret Thatcher would never have made him a minister. No one would have made him a minister. But John Major shouldn't have looked the other way, and William Hague certainly shouldn't have looked the other way, and knows he shouldn't, and has said as much.
Can you explain why it happened?
Yes, he was a very successful con man. Matthew isn't being correct. In fact, he fooled at least half the Conservative Party for nearly all of the time of which he was around. The half that wasn't fooled was the Edward Heath half. Edward Heath was shattered when he became selected as a candidate and knew the trouble coming. But in fact, Margaret Thatcher liked him because of his charm, his energy, his wit, which I didn't personally see any wit, but he actually brought in loads of loot. And that's how he managed to displace Lord McAlpine. She made him deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, the second largest party task of all. And then, of course, he switched his delights to John Major immediately, who also sucked him in, also took the funding, also took the freebies, all the aeroplane flights and all the rest of it that he offered to members of the party. And then the same trick he played with William Hague. This man is a brilliant con man. That's how he's managed to make so much money and fool so many of the people all the time. And perhaps he fooled the Conservative Party most profoundly. He didn't fool the Iraqi Kurds and a lot of other people who suffered, including, I think, his former secretaries who suffered from him very badly indeed. Several of them talked to me about it.
Peter Hill, what do you think of that?
Well, I think he was pretty stupid as well, because he didn't even take the trouble to stay in good spirits with his co-conspirators, because one by one he insulted them. He didn't give them the money that he said he was going to give them. He let them all down, and in the end, of course, they blew the gaff on him.
Of all the things that are said against him, all the allegations, I think that what Emma says about the Iraqi Kurds is the one that worries me most. Of course, we don't know the whole truth of this, but that one does worry me. That he took the Conservative Party in, well, more fool them as far as I'm concerned.
Jay Leno, American talk show host, says that politics is show business for ugly people. Why do you think politics tends to attract these types?
Jeffrey never wanted power. He just wanted attention. He was a performer. He was, like many people in politics, simply an attention seeker. And if he'd been able to loop the loop, if he'd been able to jump through hoops, if he'd been a trapeze artist, he'd have done that. If he'd been able to write well, he would have done that. I hope he passes his literary test at Belmarsh, incidentally. I'm not sure that he will. He did that for a little while, but the thing that he could do best was charm crowds, and he only wanted attention in the end.
And what's so puzzling, Mr. Aitken, is this moment where Jeffery Archer goes into the 1987 trial with this fake diary and holds it in the witness box, and the pages are taped up so people can't see that it's fake, that he had the guts to do that. And, of course, it makes us think of your sword of truth speech and the fact that you, having been caught in a lie, decide to go and take it through the courts and defend yourself. What brings it upon all of you to take that course against the odds?
I think it's very few of us who are foolish and arrogant enough to take such a high-wire and high-risk route. And I've learnt my lesson and don't defend it at all. I think people do sometimes get blinded by their own pride and their own arrogance. I think it's fair to say that sometimes that is a defensive mechanism also to being attacked, as Matthew Parris has reminded us, not always by scrupulous newspaper methods and accuracy. But that's no excuse for what happened, I think, in both my case and Archer's case.
And Lady Nicholson, he's also sent to Belmarsh today, we gather, were in the same van as him, a drug dealer jailed for life for a stabbing, a man accused of molesting children, and another man who's being tried for murder. He's had his comeuppance, hasn't he?
I think white-collar crime is just as important. What about the Anglia shareholders? What about the shareholders that his son appears to have cheated? You know, he's been debarred from trading in the City of London. What about his father, who also seems to have been some form of a con man? I wonder if, in some sort of quirky way, there isn't some inherited dysfunction which makes them able to disregard the plight of ordinary people and make their own way and make their own money and push everybody else to the side, including, I'm sorry to say, his wife.
But again, it comes back to the question, does it not, of why your party didn't spot that? I mean, we saw the false starts at Oxford there. It was going back all that time. All of this was out in the open.
All this was out in the open, as was his cheating on his expenses for the United Nations, which happened, as we know, with the UNA, United Nations Association, another very early tragedy. People didn't pick up and didn't register except the UNA. I fully agree with you. It was a disgrace that he was made Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, but the money bags he dangled in front of their eyes. The morality of the Conservative Party has been shot to pieces for a considerable long time now. Reliance on these huge donors, including Jeffery Archer, has driven away the small supporters. So I fully support your point. This is really bad news all round, and I must admit that I'm delighted that white-collar crime should at last be given the same sentence as ordinary criminals who you've identified.
I'm afraid I'm more amused than delighted. He reminds me of Toad of Toad Hall, and if from Belmarsh Prison anybody should see somebody dressed as a washerwoman making their escape, it wouldn't surprise me if it were Jeffery Archer. Yes, you're right, Emma. He did fool... well, he's fooled both your parties, actually. He fooled the Conservative Party, or rather, he fooled the Conservative Party. Liberal Democrats, or Liberals in their day, were fooled by Jeremy Thorpe. We're all fooled by big, charming, beguiling
Jeremy
characters.
Thorpe
We're easily
simply
fooled.
did not, in my opinion, and I have, of course, known him. He was a family friend. My father was a Conservative Member of Parliament. Jeremy was a friend of his, by the way. He was a friend of everybody, too. He certainly didn't, in my knowledge, have the same impact on millions of people, shareholders, people in extremists, such as the Kurdish people. Jeffrey cut a swathe through a lot of very ordinary people's lives and savings and income. That's unforgivable.
He's also entertained millions of people. People.
Well, I thought you said he wasn't a good writer. I mean, I personally think a good writer is probably judged by the numbers of people he reads, and therefore I think the Star has the merit over you at the moment.
I don't buy this business of he's a likeable rogue. He's actually a crook. He did steal £500,000 from the Star. It's an awful lot of money. 14 years ago, it was a hell of a lot of money. He's a crook. He's not a likeable rogue.
He's certainly a crook. I don't deny for a moment that he's a crook. I'm just interested in the phenomenon of crooks whom we can't entirely find it in our hearts to hate. You two may hate him, but Horatio Bottomley in the early part of this century cheated a lot more people of a lot more money and yet still drew audiences when he came out of prison. I'd simply make the point that it's an interesting phenomenon.
Thank you all, Mr. Aitken, Matthew Parris, Peter Hill, Emma Nicholson. Thank you all very much indeed. The spoof letters of Henry Root some 30 years ago included one he wrote to the London Standard, which simply said, "Dear Sir, I wish to complain most strongly about everything." On the edges of the Genoa summit tonight, there are now more than 50,000 protesters whose reason for being there is exactly that. So far, there hasn't been any violence, but the sheer volume of people who want to complain most strongly about everything has meant the annual meeting of G8 leaders looks like it's taking place in siege conditions. Gordon Brewer is there, and last time we saw you at a summit was Gothenburg. Gordon, have lessons been learned about crowd control since then?